Hi, and welcome to this first video on what is doctrine. Juggling. What comes to your mind when I say the word juggling? 3 balls, perhaps? A clown? Discs and tricks and unicycles and bowling pins? But what if I'm not talking at all about this? What if I'm talking about juggling time? Suddenly, images of rushing around, booked calendars, and a stressed me pulling my hair out in front of a mirror come into focus in my mind's eye. Today, I want to expound on what is doctrine. I want to explain it in such a way that every time in these videos I mention doctrines, we're both on the same page about what I mean by the word doctrine. I don't want it to be ambiguous like the word juggling. Doctrine is, after all, the core of this church. It's the fuel behind the flame of our existence, the essence of our actions, the roots of virtue. Doctrine is what defines our surroundings and circumstances, and doctrine sets a judgment bar for each of us, a goal to reach. Without an understanding of doctrine, we are akin to a deaf bat. It can move, and it can make as much sound as it wants, but it's going to be completely and utterly lost. So, what is doctrine? And when I say that something is a doctrine of the church, what do I mean? We've all had those uncomfortable moments in gospel doctrine class where a member rebukes the teacher for preaching some false doctrine and whipping out his 1879 General Conference quote condemning that teaching. I'm going to define doctrine as teachings in 4 different layers. The innermost being the most important and definite or well-defined, and the outermost being the least relevant and most unsure. The first inner layer is what I'll call core doctrines. These are eternal truths which are keys for guidance and salvation and are, well-defined. For example, the doctrine that Christ is resurrected from the dead is a core doctrine. It is absolutely and utterly unmistakable and key in the beliefs of Latter-day Saints. This is an unchanging, eternal fact which is well understood. Think of it as the theory of gravity. It's been tested true so many times that we accept it as unchanging fact. The second layer are supporting doctrines. These aren't necessarily key truths to know for our salvation, but they do help motivate us and better understand God's plan. For example, the teaching that Jesus Christ suffered pains and temptations is a teaching which I would call a supporting doctrine. It's not necessary for us to be saved to know that he suffered. We only need to know that he atoned. But it is a source of huge relief and peace to all those suffering now to know that he, the greatest of all who have been born on this earth, has already suffered what you're going through and pioneered a path through your struggles onward to happiness. These teachings build us up, flesh out the core doctrines, and help us better understand God's character and plan. The third layer is what we'll call policy doctrines. This is where the line between truths, teachings, and applications starts to get a little bit more blurry. A good example of a policy doctrine is that one must obey the word of wisdom, as stated in section 89 of the Doctrine and Covenants, in order to be worthy to enter the holy temple. From our understanding of a very important core doctrine that we are created in the image of God, and a supporting teaching given from God respecting how we ought to treat our bodies, comes to life a temporal policy to apply these truths into our lives. The church has not always taught that you must obey the word of wisdom in order to enter the temples, and it could theoretically change these standards in the future. Policy doctrines are more open to cultural circumstances and can change as more light is brought onto the world, or simply as situations change. What might be right for one generation, like leaving to serve on a mission at age 19, could change for another, like when Thomas S. Monson announced that missionaries could now leave at the age of 18, and could change in the future as well. That being said, we cannot justify disobedience to these policies by our cultural differences or personal struggles. We must understand that, for our time and our place, they are the official teachings of the church. Lastly, the fourth layer is esoteric doctrine. These are non-critical, narrowly applicable teachings that can be useful to one's understanding, knowledge, and comprehension of a subject, but are often not yet fully understood or simply not terribly important truths. For example, knowing whether or not an angel has to physically coexist with a person in order to minister unto them is not nearly as important as knowing that each person is born with the guiding light of Christ in them. I personally love understanding more about esoteric doctrines, but they're just not that important and can cause a lot of confusion. Now, as we start to understand these layers, we can begin to form a better picture of what is and isn't doctrine, and what all we should believe from what we hear in our Sunday schools. Core doctrines are eternal truths which we must steadfastly grasp onto for our dear lives and, our eternal salvation. When people try to threaten our understanding of this doctrine by tainting them with lies or misinformation, we need to be ready to make a stand for the true doctrine of God. However, when a group of friends are discussing a rather esoteric doctrine, it might be okay to just listen to what they're saying and understand that this may or may not be true, and try to glean good lessons from it while understanding that it doesn't need to be mentally written in stone. Policy doctrines are important to keep updated on, and supporting doctrines should pop up and illuminate our study of the scriptures and the details of our lives. When we correctly set our mental frame surrounding these authorized teachings, we can better understand what is and isn't doctrine, and we're better equipped to cope with the shock that a new truth or a policy change can bring to us. Occasionally, questions of doctrine will come to us either by study or by way of our fellow man that may shake us. When this happens, it's a good idea to look at what kind of doctrine we're talking about. For example, if we're talking about how divining rods work and we're using the early church, I immediately know that while it might be fruitful to get to the bottom of this mystery, I don't need to balance my testimony of God on the matter, and it's okay for me to shelf the question for a while until I may feel better prepared to seek an earnest God-sent answer. In conclusion, we can define a doctrine as an authoritative teaching and classify them into 4 rankings of definition and importance. 1. Core doctrine. It is extremely well defined and utterly important. 2. Supporting doctrine. It's generally well defined and it's pretty important. 3. Policy doctrine. Normally well stipulated, but subject to change, and important more in our day-to-day lives than in our eternal salvation. 4th, an esoteric doctrine. It's usually not well defined and not important to our salvation. Remember that these definitions aren't exact, but rather more like a pH testing paper, where we can get a sense of how important a teaching ought to be to us by a quick at-a-glance test. With a pH testing paper, all you do is you check the color, and you know more or less where the pH is, even though you can't have to the hundredths of certainty or anything like that. And the same with these definitions. There's a lot of in-between and gray areas, but this guide has given me a great way to understand what I'm learning and put it into the spectrum of importance in my studies.